It's Tonight with Byline Times, with me, Hardeep Matharu.
And with me, Peter Jukes. And for the next hour, we'll be bringing you what the papers don't say.
And what the TV doesn't always want to tell you. Now, coming up on tonight's show, Prince Harry's memoir, Spare, has become the fastest-selling non-fiction title in history. But aside from the salacious reporting of Kate versus Meghan and Camilla as the wicked stepmother, it has big revelations about the concerning relationship between the British press and the royal family. So to dig down further into this, we will be hearing from Catherine Mayer, who is Prince Charles's biographer and the co-founder of the Women's Equality Party. We'll also be joined tonight in the studio by journalist Annette Dittert. We'll be getting her take on what the world thinks about Britain now that Prince Harry has added more bombshells on top of Brexit. And, of course, Brexit. We'll be discussing the B word with Annette and getting her take on whether the Labour leader Keir Starmer is right to want to take back control of the project.
Well, it's 2023, Hardeep. Is it too late to say Happy New Year? And what a year ahead we have. So we've already begun our big documentary, our blockbuster 90-minute documentary about Brexit, presented by Mark Goldsworthy. You'll be able to see clips of that over the weeks ahead. We'll go from that immediately into another big documentary, in this case, in Ukraine, with John Sweeney. We'll be looking at Vladimir Putin's World War III. We also feel we need to get out and about more. You may remember the early days of Byline TV, Kaylin talking to turkey farmers, oyster fishermen and road hauliers. And we want to do more of those, plus those great explainers that you did, Hardeep, the one about Priti Patel, or the one by Otto English about the truth about Boris Johnson. Now, to do that, they're amazing. They're some of the most popular material we do. It is a bit difficult to maintain 2 live shows a week. So you might have heard us say tonight with Byline Times, not Friday night with Byline Times. Why? Because we want to be more responsive, not just on Friday night, but any night when there's big breaking news. Because news doesn't happen just on a Friday, often it's over by the Friday. So we thought this is the better way to give you more value, to follow the story rather than just the news cycle, and get more of those breaking news, those in-depth explainers and field reports we miss so much.
Yes, and you all know that we love spending Friday nights with you. And some of you might be disappointed that Friday night with Byline Times is changing. But as Peter said, it will free us up in terms of time and resources to bring you more cutting-edge analysis and exclusive reports. So rather than seeing less of me and Peter, you'll be seeing more of us.
I'm afraid that's true. And talking about breaking reports, well, this week there's really only one big story which we look at from a slightly different lens than the salacious gossip and things about the royal family, but about the state, and particularly the state of journalism. And so, as you mentioned, this is just a great occasion, especially. What did Harry say about the media?
Yeah, I mean, I was very excited by the release of his book, Peter, because what it uncovers about this relationship between the British press and, well, the head of state and the family of the head of state, 2 massive pillars of power propping each other up and reliant on each other in this sort of codependent relationship, is pretty extraordinary. So on one of his interviews with, I think it was ITV, about the book, Prince Harry said that changing the media landscape in the UK is now his life's work. And I have to admit, my jaw dropped to the floor because I thought, wow.
It's Byline Times' life work.
But also a prince of the realm saying that. And I think why it's riled the more established media is because, you know, he knows how it works. He's the ultimate insider. And so if Prince Harry is saying there's some very concerning things going on, which go beyond just himself and Meghan, then that does put them on tricky ground.
Yeah, no, we'll hear a bit more later about the hacking that went around Harry. And we'll be joined in a moment by Annette Dittert to tell us what on earth somebody from Germany makes of all this craziness. But before we do that, let's just turn to a clip of Prince Harry discussing why he's come out and, in an unusual fashion, because they usually speak through proxies, a member of the royal family telling his own story.
In some ways, the reaction to Prince Harry's memoir by the more established press is completely unsurprising. We're going to be digging into that a bit more in just a moment. But first, we are joined in the studio by journalist Annette Dittert. Welcome back to the show, Annette.
Thanks for having me.
No,
again.
Real pleasure. Now, what do you make of this? What is your sense of what the world is making of Britain now that these new bombshells have been added to already everything that's happened that we've discussed before about Brexit, etc.? Do you think this is really a significant moment, Prince Harry's book, or not really?
I think so, yeah. I think it's underestimated a bit. I think people always treat the whole monarchy as a soap opera, which it isn't. It's an important part of the constitutional setup. It's an institution with lots of money, lots of influence. And I think the interesting thing is, and that's not any different in Germany than here, that most journalists do have opinions on it and report on it, as a soap, and don't understand that if this thing is undermining the monarchy in Britain, this will create a lack of stability, I think, in the country. And I think it has the potential, this book, to sort of destabilize the monarchy, not imminently, but in the middle and long run. Because if you look at younger people of color, they are disgusted about what they're reading there.
Yeah.
The book sells well. So I think it's more dangerous than some people think.
Yeah.
Not imminent, not directly, but in the mid and long term.
Do you think that's particularly the case now that sort of, the Queen's death means that we have Prince Charles, Prince William, Prince Harry? She was really revered for
as long as she
doing
was
that
there,
role.
She was just holding it back. It's almost like now it can really explode. Maybe the book wouldn't have been that provocative if she had been still there. Who knows? I don't know. But it's like now it's sort of, fire. You can fire now at everybody.
Do you think on the world stage, the Queen did, because of sort of the unique individual that she was and how she fulfilled that role, that somehow, there's always been discussion, and not prominently, about the royal family, what it represents, sort of notions of imperialism and aristocracy in Britain, inequality. But do you think that the Queen was such a unifying figure that she, even on a world stage, managed to maintain this reputation of the monarchy to the world?
It will be definitely much more difficult to do that for King Charles. But I think it won't be so much generally in the world. I think the first domino stones that will start falling is the Commonwealth. Because I think these people will be particularly appalled by all these allegations that Harry makes in his book. And I think, we have already a few who have been leaving, and I think others will follow soon. And then there is not much left, because if the Commonwealth just remains a very, very loose line thing where most people think maybe we don't need these white guys anymore. That will be difficult. And I think this is a development that's certainly accelerated by this book. And that's where they will feel the consequences.
And have you seen any difference between the reaction in Britain compared to, say, the US, where Prince Harry and Meghan Markle now live? Is there a sense that in America there's an appetite for him to be telling these sort of bombshells and his truth, as he calls it?
I think what has happened, and that's really interesting because that more or less is exactly what he describes in this book. The British press is very much on the side of the monarchy. And the whole thing, the palace has been silent, has reacted in a dignified way. But this is not true. They have been firing from everywhere through the tabloids, through the papers. And that's why you see a very hostile reception here in Britain compared to a much less hostile reception in the US and also in Germany.
Just as a journalist trained in Germany, a brilliant journalist, I must say, and that does some of the best films on Brexit, better than ones in the UK. Are we all mad? The emotional reaction of somebody like Jeremy Clarkson or Piers Morgan, these royal columnists, and Catherine Mayer talks about them in a moment, who just make up stuff and say, oh, she's looking out the window this way, all the kind of soap drama. Do we look completely stupid? Does our journalism look tainted like a form of obsequious flattery as a court, not as proper journalism?
The British press has probably the worst reputation of all press or media outlets in the world, I think. In Germany, for sure, people know that. And there have been discussions in the media press as well about that. I don't think Britain looks mad in general. I mean, this is not Britain.
Right.
But the British press is certainly, I mean, especially the tabloid press, is certainly more aggressive, more shameless, and more outrageous than most other tabloids I know.
So we lead on something. British excellent
Exactly,
is on us.
yes.
And it's not the same with the broadcast. The broadcast, I mean, obviously he chose to go to ITV. Our broadcast is quite respected, but it is actually EBU score for press trust. We're down the bottom of all European
world
countries.
leading.
I just wonder why that is. I mean, do you sense it is that there is, you know, this strange English behind closed doors of the press with the police we've documented, with politicians and with the royalty? Or is it something peculiar about royalty, which has to govern kind of through public relations? It gets its mandate through being sort of public assent, and they think the media is the best way to get that.
Yeah, I think, I mean, what is very particular here, I think, other than in other countries with monarchies in Europe, is that the monarchy has more influence, more power, and more money, and gets more taxpayers' money, and that's why it needs this very close relationship with the press to be seen, to be there, and to justify its existence. And I think what Harry describes in his book, and that's what I found the most interesting thing about the book, is this toxic closeness between palace and the press. That does exist. I mean, wherever you look, it's always royal sources. And I mean, all these royal correspondents, Catherine will talk about that because she knows them much better than me, they do get their information directly from the palace. So they do speak to them, but it's not transparent. Yes. And that's the problem, I think.
So we're going to be talking to you about Brexit
Yes.
in a bit. But just one last thing that I found interesting when Harry was doing some of his interviews. He described that he was talking about how him and Meghan and the sort of backlash against them and then their eventual departure sort of mirrored Brexit, and he named it a culture war that's taking place in Britain. And I just thought that was really interesting observation that he made, that actually does their story fit into a wider context, perhaps, of Britain turning in on itself and feeling very defensive.
I mean, they made that link in their soap. It's not really a documentary, I would say, but in this Netflix thing they did, where they clearly linked the Brexit vote and the increasing xenophobia to the increasing attacks on Meghan and the increasing racism. It was just a very short passage, but it was picked up immediately by the press, which was not very surprising. So they made that connection themselves.
And I think the press are desperate for a new culture war to distract from the NHS crisis and the bidding mainly.
It's helpful for everyone who's in power here at the moment.
And I mean, so
it's awful, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
The anti-woke stuff's died down. They try to create a culture war about trans people. Along comes this to kind of prove the point. And as Annette was saying, Catherine Myers, another journalist who's covered this, a proper journalist, and we'll be hearing from her in a moment about the relationship with the royals and the press and all these maintaining a dignified silence. And she'll be answering a question: how much does this episode threaten the legacy of Charles and William? You remember a time, you know, in our lifetimes when somebody senior in the royal family came forward with their own voice? Because usually they're reported, it's somebody else writing on their behalf.
I can remember a time very recently when somebody did that, and it was a total disaster for the royals and for him, and that was, of course, Prince Andrew, thinking that he could sit down and speak in his own voice and convince us all that there was nothing to see here, move on, move on. That was a really interesting moment, because you're right. You know, Diana collaborated with Andrew Morton. Charles collaborated with Jonathan Dimbleby. Those two books, one of them, it was Charles's collaboration with Jonathan Dimbleby was transparent to the extent that it was public, that he was doing that he had given Jonathan access to documents and also to him. There have been other times where that is less transparent, but where royals, including him, have worked with journalists who are covering them. But to have that kind of unmediated voice of a royal is a very, very rare thing indeed. And one of the funny things about that Andrew interview is that I had actually, to the extent that I feel it's for me to advocate anything to the royals, I have said to them very directly at times that the system of press management is massively out of date if it was ever appropriate, and that the lack of transparency is a problem in an institution that needs to be accountable. And so I had sort of, in many ways, suggested that royals should put themselves up for questioning.
And what happened with Andrew Mateless?
And then I was watching,
set him up.
like the rest of the world, I was watching that through my fingers, thinking, "Oh my God, why did anybody there think that that was a good idea?" But the point stands that there is. The royal system is really interesting because most institutions, I mean, we're now seeing Downing Street having lied consistently for example, over Partygate, one lie after another there. But there was, until recently, a kind of expectation of institutions of state that they would answer questions and that they would answer. They might be economical with the truth, but there would at least be some truth in there.
And it's in statute, freedom of information. They are funded by the public purse. The public should know what their employees are doing.
Exactly. They're exempted from freedom of information requests, the monarch and the heirs. And that means that coverage, this is encouraging this level of poor coverage. So even though I'm being critical of journalism here, I'm also critical of the institution. There's a very unhealthy relationship between the two, because what it's doing is basically it makes for very reductive coverage. And the coverage is also incredibly sort of personality driven. It's very rarely about any of the bigger questions, like what does it mean for the way in which we live and the way in which the country's governed to have at its heart, as one of the institutions of state, something that enshrines historic privilege and inequality, for example.
It's basically turned it into a soap opera. It's an entertainment. It's a form of who's in, who's out, affairs and things like that. It's not about matters of state.
Exactly. And that also serves that sort of tourist attraction narrative. Which you see time and again.
Another one is transparency, openness. And you're saying that Andrew was a false attempt at that. Obviously, Harry...
It was kind of... That's an interesting one. It was his voice, but it depends whether you think that everything he said was 100% truthful, whether you describe that as transparency. But what it was direct access, which is the rare quality.
But this is the problem, isn't it? They cannot answer back. So there's a huge space for, let me say, slightly mercenary or unconscientious journalists just to fill it with rubbish. I mean, it's a great job. You could imagine, not saying you would, there is a role for a royal correspondent completely fabricating things based on what somebody looked like in a car or what a friend said. I mean,
it happens all the time. So one of the spectacle of some sections of the press, the ones I'm being rude about, basically, responding to Prince Harry's autobiography. A lot of it is this outrage where they feel, that they're accusing him of telling lies. And I'm like looking at them thinking, like, I've read stuff that I know is absolutely fictitious.
I think there's a line, never complain, never explain.
Yes.
But obviously...
But they did. So
they did. They're lying about that.
Yeah. So one of the things why Harry got exercised about this is because he felt that they could have issued statements in defence of him and more recently in defence of Meghan. He is very aware of the fact that if they want something to get out there, they will find a friendly journalist and give them the story. So there's been a lot of stuff about the dignified silence that the palace is maintaining in response to the autobiography. And every time I see that phrase, I just laugh, because you've seen stories against the autobiography that quote sources in the palace, that quote friends of the royals. Those stories don't appear by magic
Does this mark a sea change along with the book from what you've seen with this kind of cozy system of journalists and access and lies and half-truth, a kind of vortex of royal coverage? Now we've got somebody taking the papers to court.
Sort of. I mean, I think actually there have been lawsuits, but they've been handled differently. But I also think one of the things that's happened is the monarchy has managed to survive as long as it has, in part by doing this thing of modernising imperceptibly to sort of track what's happening in the wider world. But they sort of lost... They lost that ability to track at the point where, quite frankly, many institutions did, with the rise of social media and the atomisation of mainstream media, and also the weakness of mainstream media. So the thing is, if you look at the wider context, I think it's quite hard to argue that journalism hasn't suffered a decline in lots of ways anyway, because there are now fewer people, fewer experts of any kind on staff. You know, fact-checking departments a thing of the past. A lot more journalism rather than journalism. And so it's made... and a lot more clickbait. So it's basically changed the nature of journalism, and they haven't adapted fast to that. As I say, I mean, they're by no means the only institution that's having that problem. I would say in that situation we're in, where journalism is already struggling and where there's this huge challenge to public trust, and where right-wing populism is massively taking advantage of that, journalism is more important than ever. So the problem is that Harry's now kind of backed himself into this position of being the person who's going to clean up the media, clean up the press. He doesn't really know, unfortunately, what that is. He has this visceral and very real experience of all the terrible things they've done to him. And they really have. I mean, he's been hacked, he's been lied about, he's had his privacy intruded on from childhood.
He is breaking privacy
Yeah.
in some way. He's coming forward with and probably breaking other people's privacy. Is this quite disruptive? As it seems to be on the mediascape, it's a feeding frenzy. But it does feel the monarchy is at this moment, we're in the interregnum between an accession and a coronation. Is this kind of a critical moment, you having been Charles's biographer?
I think that the Harry and Meghan story is a huge, much bigger problem for the monarchy than the monarchy recognises. And the reason for that is, one of the other reasons monarchy survives is not because everybody's a wild fan of the monarchy, but because people don't care very much one way or the other. In order to create change, you need people to really care enough to do that. And with this, there were a lot of people who hadn't cared one way or the other who were enthused by the arrival of Meghan in the royal ranks.
Absolutely different group of people. You have the Sussex squad online, you have people turning up to the wedding. It was the monarchy tried to modernise themselves, and people, I remember seeing that wedding, thought that's cool. That's a bit different.
So it was younger people, it was demographics that they didn't usually reach. It was populations of colour, and many of those people are now implacable opponents.
So, Annette, another British institution kind of crumbling or creaking. We spent the last 4 years almost at Byline Times looking at the stresses in British society. And you've written so brilliantly and produced so brilliantly, as somebody who's lived in Britain for 14 years or something, 15 years, the effect of Brexit on all this. Before we get to Brexit in particular, were all these things already wrong in this country? I mean, the monarchy existed before we had the Brexit vote. The right-wing press, it almost got corralled by Leveson inquiry and the phone hacking allegations, but got out of its box and doubles down. Can you look back to before Brexit in those first 8 years in this country and see what was about to come, what this malaise would be demonstrated for the last 6 years?
In hindsight, I don't think I saw it coming. I mean, not early on, not when I arrived. When I arrived, I I saw a wonderful, lively, happy, wealthy country. I mean, I remember very, very vividly the Olympics. I mean, that was Britain at its best. And I would never have, in my wildest dreams, thought that this could go downhill so quickly. But in hindsight, if I think about it, I mean, the press and the way it distorts and lies is something that I found when I arrived quite shocking. I was really like, what? It took me a while to get adjusted to it. Now, for me, it's almost normal, but it's not.
Yeah, it's the water we swim in. So
Exactly.
there are tabloid German papers, aren't there?
Yes, but they are boring student papers compared to the Daily Mail, even the worst ones. It's really different. And I think, looking back now, having such a kind of press that can lie without consequences, and then having a political class where you depend on the good chaps that sort of goes that way, then of course the public is lost at some point, because you cannot go against these lies, because you don't really have an independent press, you don't really have an independent public broadcaster with the BBC, because they're directly dominated by the government, which shouldn't be the case with a public broadcaster. So I think in hindsight, given the media scene as it is, the media landscape as it is in Britain, was certainly not helpful when the Brexiteers came along.
Yeah, it's really interesting, because I was just about to ask you that question, quite blunt one, you know, but for the press, would Brexit have happened? And I guess what you're saying is, when something like Brexit happens and the campaigns were run in that way, with, you know, misleading statements and lies and you know, xenophobia and all this rhetoric,
Nobody really confronted them.
No one confronted it.
The BBC didn't do it. The tabloids didn't do it.
The tabloids went along, as we know. The Telegraph.
Yeah.
They were
On the
introduced
contrary.
to meet the Cambridge Analytica
of course.
Before the Brexit referendum. The Sun registered for the EU referendum vote as a campaigning organisation.
There's also all the years before, the stories about the bendy bananas written by Boris Johnson. It laid the
Murdoch
groundwork.
clearly wanted it. Then you had, I mean, it's still not really proven what role Russian money has played in this. But I mean, I remember when Putin came, I don't know when that was, when May was still prime minister, he more or less told her to get on with Brexit.
He said,
it's a fascinating clip I saw on Twitter the other day, and I thought, yeah, I mean, that was so. I think Britain was prone to fall into that trap, and the structure of democracy and the structure of the media weren't very helpful, because it was all too vulnerable.
Peters describes this, I think, in the December print edition of Byline Times. You've written a poem about describing Russia Brexit as the Trojan horse, which Britain let in.
With the money.
It's a very good
basically.
point,
because the oligarchs, the money, and partly ideology, because they're authoritarian, but more London grad, it laundered people like Boris Johnson. Of course, they want to go party with the Lebedevs. Of course. and obviously they attempted, they funded the FD. I think there's Russian money in that.
I mean, there's Russian money in most of these authoritarian right-wing populist movements in Europe, and there is certainly, I mean, I cannot prove that, I don't know, but it's very likely that there's quite a lot of money that went into the Brexit campaigns as well.
Yeah, well, we know that the RT and Sputnik did as much, had more reach and impact, and it was counted, the DCMS committee estimated worth at least £4 million of their pushing for Brexit, let alone all the bots and trolls from St. Petersburg, Prigozhin, a name now Wagner, well known, his thing. But I always say to people, it's not, you know, there was a precondition. It could have pushed it over the edge, Russian money. And that right-wing press. So I'm going to just push a little bit deeper on that, because I do think, as you both say, it's the lies, unaccountability, 250 million a week to the NHS. We now know is absolute abject lie. They've defunded the NHS. What underlies that? Is that class? Is it that these top, you must have met them, you know, most of the editors, even in a tabloid like The Sun, a public school or private school educated, Boris Johnson, Eton, Gove, obviously went to state school, Oxford, Bullingdon Club, David Cameron. And the media is dominated by people who seek power, and often the upper middle classes. Is the media shaped by class underlying it?
Absolutely. I mean, the class system is so vivid, so alive here still. That's something, when I came, was also a big surprise, because I thought, this is really interesting. And then if you look at the behavior of most of these Tory prime ministers who went to Eton, like Cameron, I mean, he just didn't care whether he lost or not. It's like, if it goes wrong, what the hell? I mean, daddy pays for the broken pop. like in this fantastic theatre play.
He walked to the door back into Downing
when
Street.
they just destroy this pub and then and
that moment,
that's
exactly that. That's exactly it.
And he lied already before the referendum. I mean, in 2012 when I came, or 8 even earlier, I was always surprised how much he lied about Europe. Already then, it was quite decent compared to what came after that. But he did do that already in the very beginning.
There's always a fight against Europe. We're going to get them to do our way. There's no positive thing from him ever said about Europe.
Which is so weird, because Britain played such an important role inside the EU. I mean, all these laws that Rees-Mogg wants to scrap now, which is another idiotic remnant of the high Brexit time, which hopefully won't happen, by the way. Because you cannot just scrap 4,000 EU laws within 6 months, which they want, and have no plan what comes after. That's just Brexit all over again. But that was sort of, this recklessness. I don't care. I just go, la, 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 I just leave. I mean, of course, he was also a bit nervous, but still, that was quite a surprise. And I think that made it more possible. Because if some serious politician who had something to lose would have been there, he might have thought about the whole thing a bit more seriously and not just gambled.
Yes. He was a gambler, wasn't he? He gambled with the EU, gambled with the coalition. But you're right, a gambler who has a bank.
Who has nothing to lose. They're all gamblers with nothing to lose.
Such an interesting point. It's also when you talk about class. I think, I talked to you for the December edition of Byline Times, and it's an article called The Brexit Trap. And I also spoke to David Goodhart, who was the author of a famous book, The Road to Somewhere. The Road to Somewhere, and his sort of his framing of it being a battle of anywhere people versus somewhere people.
But somewhere is nowhere, or
arguably,
but never really explained where they want to drive.
But even he was saying when we talked about empire, he was saying he doesn't think Brexit was driven by imperial nostalgia, but even he acknowledged that there was something in the fact that Britain had this amazing empire, and therefore there is this notion, perhaps it's completely linked to class, that we can't take rules from the EU, these member states. We're Britain, we had the empire.
Exactly.
And even he acknowledged that form of thinking for him was very alive, which I think ties into this notion of, the sort of elite rulers that we've had and their attitude to the EU, and why is it framed in that way?
I think it has also to do with it's either losers or winners here. Cooperation is nothing we do here in this country. I mean, even when you look at the setup of Parliament, it's like enemies. I mean, they fight each other, whereas European parliaments are set up as a round. So you cooperate, you have coalitions. All this is unthinkable here. So it's either me or you. And the idea to cooperate, and that's part of the class system as well, and the idea to cooperate is something that is alien to this upper class in a way. It's either they're ruling or they lose and they're down, but in a very simple way. But it's quite interesting because I think it has to do with it as well, yes.
You can see this very much in the Tory leadership campaign. So what happens, therefore, to the other thing Britain was once famous for? I mean, humour's been ruined by Boris Johnson because he was quite funny, but he was also a terrible prime minister. But we had a reputation, or maybe it's in my head, for science and truth. Philip Hammond was on the radio, I think, today, saying, what did they think? We could go out, leave the EU and join the world, because the world doesn't care about us anymore. So do you think we always argue, is it the story, the David Goodhart story is there's elites and the people. What Hardeep and I have discussed, are there actually competing elites? There was a kind of Remainer elite, a liberal elite, and this kind of illiberal London metropolitan elite took over, as we write. That basically, Britain is very schizophrenic. There is this tradition of generosity and tolerance, welcoming strangers. And how do you, as somebody's, you're a resident now, but you've lived here for 14, 15 years, make sense of these two Britons? Or are they the same Britain?
I think it's somehow the same Britain. I think the humour comes out of this feeling you can't do anything about the power of the upper classes. Whenever I talk to my British friends, when there's something like, I live on that canal and British Waterways, or now Canal River Trust, is constantly raising the fees. And I said to my co-boaters, why don't we just do something against it? And everybody looked at me like, it won't work. we will lose. And my instinct as a European, I mean, which I'm still a little bit, although I've been here for a long time, is always to say, let's just try it, let's fight it. I mean, this is not right. And the feeling is, and we didn't do it in the end, is like we will lose anyway. So, and I think out of this fatalism comes this special kind of humor, because what do you do when you cannot do anything? So you try to make the best of it by being stoic and funny. And I think that's what happened a bit. And so it's all sort of one, I think it's not old Britain, new Britain. I think it all has to do with each other somehow.
So what do you make, Annette, of Keir Starmer's approach to this now? I think last week he gave a speech and said that he wants to take back control of the narrative around Brexit. He wants a Labour government to look at how that position could be improved. Do you think that is a realistic prospect for a potential Labour government? Or?
I mean, I totally understand the tactical aspects of it, the strategy behind it, to not touch on Brexit, to not lose the red wall again, and to not get this whole culture war up and running again. He doesn't want to be the target of a very easy Tory campaign saying he wants just to rejoin and that's it. I totally understand that. To imitate or take over this awful slogan, take back control, which has been, which is xenophobic and really is something even the hardcore Brexiteers don't really want to talk about anymore. That's something I think is a step too far. And I also don't really like the whole strategy, although, as I said, I do understand the tactical thinking behind it, and I think it might be sensible to win the next election. But it's a very high price the country is paying for it. Because and that's probably the worst about it, needs, if he wants to keep going like that for 18 months, he will have to be dishonest. Because he knows it's nonsense. He knows you cannot make Brexit work. And if he keeps saying that, he gets into trouble. Like the other day and today, he was on Radio 4, he was interviewed by the presenter, and she asked him whether the British economy wouldn't be much better off within the single market. And he said no. And I was almost choking on my coffee, because that's just simply not true. And he knows it's not true. And most of the Brexiteers and the Remainers know it's not true. So this means, I mean, the trust in politics and politicians here after Brexit is, I think, at an all-time low. And that's dangerous. And if you have the opposition who does exactly the same thing, lying for tactical reasons or telling untruth, it's maybe not a lie, but it's not true.
Yeah, the well has been poisoned and now it's...
Exactly. And he sort of, has fallen into that trap as well and is also poisoning. He should be honest. He should just say, we will not be able to rejoin anytime soon, so we won't try it because of the Tories. And then he could also, because the Tories will always be troubled, so Brussels will not want Britain
this
back.
Is what Christopher Gray says.
That would be so much better just to say, I'd like to do that, but we won't. And we can't because Brussels won't take us back unless the Tories would come around, which they won't. Then he could sort of put the whole thing, put Brexit on the Tories. I mean, Brexit is a Tory disaster, and he cannot really attack them properly as long as he makes it his story as well. Plus, it's undermining trust.
That's what Chris Gray said, that he should...
I agree with him there.
He should make it a Tory.
There's an interesting way in which we can bring both of our discussions together, which also comes onto the press and Keir Starmer's relationship with it and what interviews he's giving at the moment and how he's going to broach that subject of reforming the media, which we would love to hear something about from him.
Yes.
But there isn't much discussion. Again, it may be politically expedient. Why would you want to gain power and then start going after the press?
Yeah.
But is that another part of the trap, that he has to say certain things on Brexit and work with the press, a very hostile press as it is, and he has to negotiate between these two things, but can't change them explicitly?
I mean, it's just as long as the media is, and Murdoch will not ever endorse him. I think he's not Blair for him. I think he has to deal with this press, and that's something he cannot go against, I think, before the elections. So he will be very careful. Once he might have won, he can still, then maybe he can do something. I mean, there needs to be something needs to be done, that we have a more independent media here in general, also with the BBC. I mean, that is not right, what's going on there. I mean, this whole Brexomerta, as Campbell or Neil Kinnock phrased it, I mean, that it's still not being mentioned. I mean, the whole NHS crisis, it is partly down to Brexit. It's not the only factor, but you wouldn't hear that in the BBC. And whenever I've been interviewing nurses or doctors now for German television, it's not the first thing that comes up, the second or the third. And it's not mentioned here. So Starmer will have to do something about the media, but I think that's something he cannot really do, given the situation as it is before the next
It's a
election.
bit like PR. You have to
Maybe
win.
we need
under-
Prince Harry to keep lobbing his bombshells
And-
while we wait.
And let's be clear that, Blair did a deal with Murdoch and got that huge majority, and then got close to Rebecca Brooks and all that. But Simon doesn't need to do a deal with them. He can probably win without that. So just my last question is, you said you've seen it all change. Do you feel that day by day? I mean, I noticed in the shops, quality of goods getting, transport breaking down, obviously with strikes, rising cost of living. Do you, when you go back to Germany or whatever, begin to see this economic and social impact? I mean, Slovenia now has a higher GDP when you've joined.
Yes, no, it's two different worlds now. If you go, I was just in Berlin over Christmas, and it felt like back to normality in a way. I mean, here it's really nothing works anymore, if we're honest. We get used to that, but nothing works anymore. If I want an ambulance, I need to be prepared for a taxi at the same time, because you don't know whether it comes. The situation in the hospitals is just luck. You can still get very good care. The trains don't work. The rivers are polluted. I mean, it's just everything feels, I mean, that's what people tell me as well. It's not my feeling. It feels at the moment like everything is breaking down. And with austerity on top, what Sunak is doing now, what he has to do after this implosion of Liz Truss's project, is making things much worse. And I find that quite scary at the moment, I must say.
And you mentioned before the Olympics.
Yes.
Annette. What was it about that moment? I mean, it's often sort of referenced as a high watermark. But what were the values or the ethos you saw there about Britain that you hope it might be able to get back to after this?
It was just a happy, functioning country. And we don't have that anymore. People are depressed, people are ill, people are afraid of getting ill, people they're poorer, they're sick. I mean, the healthcare, I mean, the amount of money, it's like Britain pays 39% of what Germany pays for each person for the healthcare. I mean, it's totally underfunded. And now we do. I mean, you could do austerity maybe in 2012 because there was something you could save on. There's nothing you can save on anymore. So this will go really badly if Sunak insists on going down that road, because it will make everything worse. So I don't know. I think maybe it has to go even lower before people finally wake up and do something. But that's something that is so un-British. As I've learned, in France, you would have demonstrations every day by now.
Yes. One thing we have confronted is stats out today, and facts showing, I think from The Guardian, that since Brexit, every country in Europe has a declining interest in the EU, in leaving it.
Yeah, that was Jonathan.
Become a living example, once again, to the world. In this case, not after World War II, we did some great things. European Court of Human Rights helped with the German Constitution. Now we're a living example of what not to do.
It's the ultimate British exceptionalism.
Exactly, and that's sort of very helpful for the EU as well, because nobody thinks about doing that anymore on the continent.
But hopefully we will. We don't want to end on a totally sad note.
No.
It's great to have you here. You're not going. You'll be back soon. Well, when events transpire, we'll be back tonight with Byline Times. If you want to see more, we won't be doing an After Dark today, but you can see, if you are a member, the full interview with Cathy and Maya. It's 40 minutes on press, privacy, racism on byline.tv. Do sign up if you can. You help fund us. We'll go around the country trying to make these news reports, trying to show our polluted rivers and creaking Britain, and to do something about it. Meanwhile, thank you, Annette, for joining us.
Pleasure, as always.
Thank you for watching us.
And we will be back with you very soon. So we'll see you then. Thanks very much.